all the way through, she has written some important work in relation to this area and developed a forum and is bringing people together to share this knowledge. And can I just invite Elaine to come and join us to share a presentation with us?
Thank you very much for that introduction, Malik. And I'm sorry, I've been suffering with a cold all last week, so still have a bit of a remnant of it. If you can't hear me, please let me know. First of all, thank the administration, Dr. Collis, for inviting me, and Listra Charles for coming around and having a chat about it. It's the first of your conferences that I'm attending, and I hope it won't be the last. Okay. I am not going to invite you to look at any slides, though there is my presentation with the slides are in the pack, so you can look at them at your leisure. I just would invite you to listen, and if at any time you want to interrupt, you're willing to do so. Okay. You'll see from my topic, what has the dis-ease of African Caribbean migrants contributed to their mental ill health? And we are talking about mental ill health, really. And you may think, well, that's strange, dis-ease. I broke down the word disease, and we'll begin with definitions. What do I mean by dis-ease? I consulted 2 dictionaries, one American, one English. Dis, apart, the opposite or absence or of, sorry, I pretend that I can see, I can't really. Absence or deprived of a special quality. And what is ease? The state of being comfortable, freedom from fear, freedom from embarrassment or constraint. And that's the Webster's Dictionary. And then our good old Oxford Concise tells us this means a removal of quality, an absence of action. And what does ease mean? Comfort, well-being, satisfaction, fulfillment. So in this context, dis-ease, I'm proposing that it is the absence of being comfortable. And many of our Caribbean people can relate to that. They're not comfortable within their communities, and therefore they're not mentally well. They're not emotionally comfortable, and so they are not well. They may not be suffering from serious psychiatric disorders, but many of Caribbean people whom I interviewed during the time of my research complain of, I never feel really well. Sometimes there are physical manifestations, the low back pain, the stomach pain, the headaches. And when they go to the doctor, he cannot really find anything really physically wrong. But in the old days, when many of the migrants came and they frequented the doctors, they just got no relief. Because in those days, it wasn't thought that the talking remedies, therapeutic remedies, were relevant, or they didn't even think that they existed. You know, Caribbean people are happy-go-lucky, singing, dancing, calypso, reggae. These are the things that people thought associated with us. So we don't get depressed. We don't get that sort of kind of illness. Hence, you got a lot of diagnoses of schizophrenics. Didn't get people really suffering from depression, did we? And so, I am going today to talk a little bit about the history Caribbean in Britain. And I'm going to quote a famous psychiatrist, many of you may have heard about him, Roland Littlewood, who talked a lot about misdiagnosis of Caribbean people. And he says, the history of black people in Britain in general, and the African Caribbean migrant in particular, has been one of considerable dis-ease. People from ethnic minorities living in Britain, particularly those who are black, experience a variety of practical disadvantages. Particularly in the areas of housing, education, health, and employment. Those were the main difficulties when the Caribbean people came. They can also be subject in numberless everyday contexts to the potential experience of overt racism and prejudice in their face-to-face encounter with the indigenous white population. And although there is little statistical information about the general psychological adjustment, ample evidence has accumulated to show that in Britain today, black people are exposed to a variety of adverse stimuli which can add up to a quite serious hazard to mental health. You know, it's like the water dripping on a stone. It continues, and so eventually the stone wears away. And so it is that all of these tiny insults wear away the confidence of black people, and it's a hazard to mental health. And Professor Littlewood was not the only one to talk about this. Our own Agri Burke, Dr. Agri Burke, who used to be at St. George's Hospital for years, has talked also about this. Now, when black people came to this country as migrants, it seemed as though people were only aware of black people in England for the first time. Whereas if we look very carefully at the history, at English history, we'll find that black people were here since the 16th, 17th century. And so, from their presence then, a sort of pattern of looking at black people and assessing them and judging them, that pattern was set from those days. Many of those black people had been brought as slaves from Africa or from the Caribbean. And when they were given their freedom, they decided that they would not continue working as servants, and so they tried to be independent, but it was extremely difficult then as now with employment. So the feelings of people were that these people were lazy, they didn't want to work, or they did not want to continue being slaves. They wanted to work for themselves, but could not work. So then we found that walking around London, there were a number of homeless black people. And so a sort of attitude to being black in this country was born. In trying to rid Britain of the black population, those of you who know your history know that many of them were sent to Sierra Leone in Africa to found the colony of Freetown. During the 19th century, some black men settled in the various ports, Liverpool, Cardiff, Bristol, Hull, London, so that black people are not new to this country. And after the First World War, we had more black people coming. Between the two world wars, more black people coming, but many of them were black students who came, trained, and returned to their countries. And so the point I'm trying to make is that the population, the local population, were not aware of black people who were intelligent, who were able to go to the various universities, manage the same subjects that the indigenous white students were doing, become professionals, because most of them returned to their own country. And it was this idea that you're black, so you must be in inferior positions. In the early days of this discussion about racism and anti-racist practice, when the low educational achievement of black people of African Caribbean origin was always quoted, I always heard say, and I've heard this myself, but there are no black professionals in this country, really. You know, there are no black professionals. You may get one or two, but not as a rule, so they're not as intelligent as the other races, and particularly of the white indigenous population. All of this set the attitude to the white professionals in their dealings with black patients. Now, as we know, the recent, when I say recent, but the mass migration came when people were invited to come to this country, and they were invited to work in the services. And we know that it was very, very difficult for them to be promoted from the lower ranks of the services. Building up frustration, disillusionment, because during those days of recruitment, it was the mother country needs you. I remember that. The big, lovely posters, the mother country needs you. And so with the whole concept of being faithful and loyal to mother, many migrants came expecting to be accepted as children of the empire, and they were very grossly disappointed. Now, the whole question of separation and reunion, because government didn't mind how they got the workers, they didn't even seem to realize that women who were coming to work were young women of childbearing age, and they had children. Where are these children? Many of the migrants left their children in the care of grandmothers, as many of you know, or other relatives of the extended family. They came, they worked, but they were young and of childbearing age, so they began to bear children here as well. What happened to those children? No provision for child care, so many of them had to leave their children with unregistered childminders who were not particularly caring of these children. Many of them grew up to be unstimulated. Some women recall that they would go and find their children tied to the banister, sometimes to prevent them from roaming around. And then when they approached social services, they were given places in residential nurseries out in the suburban districts, where those nurseries had been built during the war for white children whose mothers were in the armed services. Now, these children were being cared for predominantly by white workers, and, as you know, a child will attach to a person who cares for them. So these children were attached to the white workers. When black mothers particularly tried to visit, they were told that they upset the children and they probably shouldn't visit. And so you got mothers pining for their children, those who were left behind at home, those who were in children's homes here. And it was a most difficult and unhappy time for some of these mothers. Talking to some of those mothers in the 70s, when I did my research, they said they were never out of our minds. We're always thinking about them. But the carers said we were upsetting them, so we didn't visit often. And then they were criticized for not visiting. They were criticized and said that out of sight, the children were out of mind. Not at all. So what happened then? Many of these mothers sent for their children who had been left behind. And as I said, children will attach to people who nurture and care for them. So they were attached to their grandmothers. When they came, they didn't know their mothers. And here you got people being extremely disturbed. The mothers themselves didn't understand the whole process of attachment, and the children were longing for the loved ones they had left behind. So you see how immigration upset the whole pattern of family life. And that, I think, is the basis of a lot of our problems still today. Because as those of us who have really read about attachment, we know that there are different patterns of attachment. Those who feel secure with their carer will be secure. Others may avoid even building up a relationship because they have lost trust. If I get close to anyone and become attached, they leave me and I'll be hurt again. So I'm not going to get close. And so people didn't trust getting close. people weren't able to talk about their feelings, how hurt they are. And still today, we have, excuse me, still today, we have those people, 30, 40, 50 years old, remembering those traumatic experiences in their early childhood. Therefore, they are not comfortable within themselves. Sorry. So, what happened to those children who were placed in residential care? For some, we don't know. We don't know what happened to them. We know that many went on to children's homes, and so they lived their whole young lives in institutions, not being attached to anyone. Number of young men who end up eventually in hospital. We saw the disproportionate numbers of young black men in hospitals. Many of them feel alone, completely alone. And we know that the incidence of suicide is high among children who have been in care, especially in residential care. When they leave residential care, there's no real home for them to go to. So, I know I must hurry, but I want to make these few points before I stop. Again, many of the migrants who came suffered from mistaken identity, right? The indigenous people had heard of the West Indies. They knew that Christopher Columbus had passed around there one day in a boat and saw these islands, and he told me he discovered them, but they were there a long time. But anyway, he was the one who brought it to the attention of the European world. And so the European countries went and, as you know, took over them. But Jamaica is the biggest of the 10 British Caribbean islands who sent migrants here, and the majority of migrants were from Jamaica in the early days. But people from other islands, they were asked, you know, is Trinidad a part of Jamaica, a parish in Jamaica? So when they said no, they were told they were being fussy. I personally had that experience when I registered at university in Manchester. And the registrar said, oh, you've come all the way from Jamaica. And I said, well, actually, I came from Trinidad. He said, why are you being so fussy? Sorry. I said to him, but, you know, if you came from Wales and I said you were from England, would you be fussy about it as well? Oh, well, you know. But people felt that they were not being recognized as individuals with a particular culture from each island has its own characteristic. So that whole sense of identity was denied them. It doesn't matter. And so even sometimes now, social workers, I remember when I taught social workers and they came for supervision, and they would say, well, the client he's from the Caribbean. I said, which island? Why? I don't know, I didn't ask. Oh, he's from Africa. Which country? I didn't ask. It wasn't seen to be important. When you walk around feeling, well, nobody cares too much about where I come from or who I am or as a person, you can't be comfortable, can you? And of course, there was inadequate systems of support that I have touched on. Social services didn't really know what to do with people. But many of the women were resilient, and many of them felt that their whole resilience stemmed from those who were born in the Caribbean, from their secure attachments there. Not that 100% were secure, because some grandmothers weren't as nurturing as they could be, but majority felt that secure foundation. Secondly, they found the nonconformist churches, when the Church of England, the established churches said, oh, we would have you in church, but our congregation wouldn't like us to have you. So they had to find other places. They found the churches, and that gave them a sense of security and belonging. But, sorry, many of the women have benefited from education. As you know, many are qualified, but some of their children have not been able to benefit, to be allowed to benefit from the education system. Many of the teachers have not had high expectations. You go into sport, or you go into music, or, you know, you're not going into academia really. So many have been disappointed. But in working with the women who, as children, had suffered broken attachments, it is necessary to listen carefully to their narratives and to give them time to reflect on whether and how their attachment needs are being met. According to Dr. John Bowlby, who is considered as the founder of, he's considered as the founder of attachment theory, the theory, and that sometimes what might have been derived from their lives in the Caribbean are not appropriate here. And they have to be helped to make appropriate changes, because their reactions to things may be easily understood, and they can get sanctioned for things that are misunderstood, that they, you know, they think are perfectly normal. For example, I'll give you one quick example. A social worker came to me and she said, I was asked to see Mrs. So-and-so because she is not coming out of her house. She is not, it was winter time, of course, and you know, we don't like to come out in winter. But she was in her house and she had her gas right full up to the height it could go. And she was dressed in a cotton dress that she would wear at home. And she said to the social workers, well, I like to wear the clothes that I used to wear in the Caribbean, so I have to keep the heat on. The social worker was sent to us to make an assessment, because they were thinking, well, she was showing signs of being mentally ill. It was as simple as that. Now, if you weren't aware of her background and so on, of Caribbean life and so on, and if you weren't, above all, able to talk to her in a way that could convince her that she had to make some changes, she could easily end up in hospital and stay there to the end of her life. So one has to be aware of that. And I know my time is up, so I must come to that. I believe strongly that a knowledge of attachment theory is invaluable in working with those who have experienced separation and loss. And when, you know, we talk about theory and people think, oh, that is highfalutin. It is not. It is just observations of people and behaviors, and then putting that in a structured, concise way that can be used then when we are dealing with people. And that is what attachment theory is about. Knowing a little bit about child development, how children relate to people who nurture them, knowing that we all become attached to people, even as adults, is important. And I see people looking at the clock. I'm also looking at it. Sorry. It is useful for all of us working to, sorry, to help people to form relationships, to understand that that sustaining of relationships is what every individual needs at every level of our lives, from, as Dr. John Bowlby said, we need attachment from the cradle to the grave. Thank you.
Thank